You're listening to Inside Content, the TV industry podcast. This show is brought to you by 3Vision, a global TV industry consultancy specialising in content acquisition, strategy, research, and business development. Each episode, we give you VIP access to the views and experiences of senior TV executives and discuss the latest TV industry trends and insights.
Welcome back to Inside Content. I'm Hayley Bull, VP at 3Vision, and today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most exciting content markets, Australia. Joining me is Dan Fahy. Dan brings a wealth of knowledge and strategic insight into what's unfolding in the Australian market. In this episode, we unpack the state of pay TV, the shifting SVOD landscape, the broadcaster-led dominance in FAST, and how local programming from Bluey to Colin from Accounts is resonating internationally.
Introducing Video Markets Tracker from 3Vision, your go-to source for global TV data. We offer regularly updated regional and global reports covering pay TV, SVOD, AVOD, and FAST across Africa, MENA, the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Make smarter decisions with insights you can trust. Learn more at 3vision.tv. Now, on to the episode.
Great. Welcome back, Dan, to Inside Content. I think last time we spoke, you were with Paramount, and now you're with Nine Entertainment. So we've got the perfect person to talk about the Australian market. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, last time we did speak, I was in London with Paramount Global, and now I'm in Australia. I'm with the Nine Entertainment company now, supporting them on one of their business transformation initiative, or the business transformation initiative, across publishing, radio, TV, free streaming, subscription streaming, ad sales, etc. I'm talking to you in my capacity as an independent, so not talking on behalf of Nine, but that's certainly the piece of work I'm engaged in at the moment.
Super. And so we're going to do something different this episode, a sort of departure from our usual podcast activity. We're going to do a spotlight episode on Australia and look at the trends and developments in the market. And why are we doing this? Well, we've got you joining us, which is super, but we are hearing fantastic things in the market, kind of anecdotally from distributors and the studios about how Australia for them is one of the most exciting markets in terms of growth for selling in US content. And we also know from data as well that UK content is doing well. If you look at some of the numbers coming out of the PACT report, last year, Australia was the biggest export market after the US for UK content as well. And growth has been relatively consistent as well for that market. So we're looking forward to looking at what's going on. Perhaps we start by looking at kind of the top line data to give our kind of listeners some context. According to our video markets tracker, we're seeing pay TV in decline, SVOD growing, linear in decline, catch-up service viewing increasing. We can talk about BVOD in a bit more detail later. And of course, the emergence of FAST. What can you tell us, Dan, about what you're seeing in terms of kind of spend across the different sectors and revenues? Where is kind of spend growing and where is it perhaps softer?
Yeah, great. So when we last spoke, as we mentioned earlier, I was with Paramount Global based in London, but I was part of the Paramount organization that spanned across Canada, UK, Australia, and obviously with the US parentage. So as I've come back to Australia, I've kept that sort of comparative lens across Australia, UK, Canada, US, because I think it's really helpful for me to understand where there are similarities in Australia between those markets and where there are differences. And I think that's probably helpful for your listeners too, because they are all big markets for UK and European program makers and distributors. So the things that are different here, if we go through the sort of the main segments, maybe we'll step in turn through pay TV, SVOD, TV revenue, and then maybe BVOD, AVOD, FAST sort of revenue. Yes, you're right. Pay TV pay TV in this market never really hit the critical mass that you see in the US or the UK. Foxtel and others here, Telstra and Fetch. I think they topped out around 3.3 or so million homes, so not quite hitting 40% penetration. And now, as you mentioned, pay TV is back down below 20% penetration here. And so it's just not a force in this market in the same way it is in UK, US, or Canada. So that's relevant. One other characteristic of the pay TV market here is the average revenue per user in pay TV is fairly static, is very static. And you might say, well, that's not bad given it's a declining base. But if you look at the ARPU profile of other markets like the UK and the US, they've got very steep climbs in ARPU in those markets. And Australia is a bit of an anomaly in that respect. Sky and Virgin in the UK still growing very healthily from an ARPU point of view, even as their base softens. In Australia, you've got a combination of a very soft base and softening, but the ARPU's flat. So I think that's relevant for program makers, distributors, because certainly Foxtel has been and still is a very big spender on programming here. So it's one of the biggest. But it's the base underpinning that is different to other markets. So that's pay TV. That's how it's sort of, I found it to be different. On the SVOD side of things, you did mention that, Hayley. SVOD is growing here. It depends which lens you look at it through. If you look at it through a pure subscriber trajectory, this market has hit a plateau. Service stacking, the number of services a household takes on average peaked a couple of years ago, and they've come off in this market. And so subscriber growth it's not in reverse, but it's certainly slowing. And I think it's slowing faster than the UK is, Hayley. The data I've seen suggests that UK still got some growth in it, and Australia's sort of is different in that respect. And just on that, I guess there's a couple of areas where Australia hasn't two of the top services here, Disney Plus and Stan, the domestic service. They don't have an ad tier in this market. And as you know, when SVOD services launch ad tiers, they do unlock further subscriber headroom. So you could say there's a little bit of a latent subscriber boost to come when everybody's got ad tiers. So that's what's happening in SVOD. But I think if you look at it through the lens of revenue, the SVOD services are growing very healthily through a combination of price rises, in the case of Netflix, password sharing crackdowns, but also the introduction of ad tiers has really contributed really meaningfully to their revenue. So very healthy trajectory in Australia for SVOD, but slightly off from a subscriber point of view compared to other markets. The other area of difference that I found is TV advertising here is very resilient compared to UK, US, and Canadian comparators. And if you look at, say, in the UK, if you looked at a chart that had linear advertising revenue on TV on one line and BVOD on another, those lines really noticeably approach one another. They don't connect or cross over, but they are approaching one another. Same in the US, same in Canada. In Australia, it's not. It doesn't look the same, that chart. It's the TV advertising line is flat, slightly declining, but BVOD hasn't really surged upwards towards it in the same way in Australia. And I think that's testament to a couple of things. One is Australia's got a very long list of protected sporting events, which has kept linear consumption really strong. But the other thing is that linear TV has made the transition to IP delivery through the broadcaster BVOD players in quite a pronounced way in Australia. I think Nine now gets the majority of its consumption on the BVOD platform to its linear channels. So linear TV and linear advertising is much more stable here than in those other markets. But I guess the corollary of that, if you look at the AVOD and the FAST market here, it's probably by comparison slightly muted here in this market, and there's a few reasons for that. One is the broadcast platforms actually were very proactive in getting into the fast market very early on. 7 Plus had a number and still has a number of fast channels on its platform. Network 10, which is owned by Paramount, has partnered up with Pluto for a number of fast channels, and Nine now has got a selective set of fast channels. So the broadcast groups have sort of really made good inroads into the fast market and the AVOD market, and that sort of kept the money for that market sort of washing around in their BVOD linear revenue line. So you don't see quite the sort of pronounced revenue growth curve around fast and AVOD that you might see in some of the other markets. And then, of course, you've got the introduction of ad tiers from the SVODs now helping grow that. So they're the sort of things that I see as distinct about Australia. And then we can get onto it if you want. There are other things that are the same, but they're the differences.
Yeah. I think there's probably, and we can get into some of the specifics around this sector when we look at kind of the competitive dynamics. But I think there's probably a case when we look at fast for saying actually that's probably evolving similarly to Europe with the fact of broadcaster-led fast surfaces as opposed to the US, where kind of broadcaster doesn't really feature in the same way. So
right.
We can look at that a bit more closely. So that's really helpful. That's given us a good view of what's going on in the Aussie market. Let's deep dive now into each sector and look at the competitive dynamics, specifically kind of who's struggling, who's resilient. You touched on linear with the ad market remaining relatively stable, being upheld by sports. When it comes to the flow of content, from our show tracker dating, we're seeing content, specifically first window scripted, increasingly going to broadcaster digital services as opposed to kind of primary channels. Do you think this is reflective of a kind of decline in linear viewing? What's your thoughts on what's going on with linear broadcast?
Yeah, so I think, and this plays into what's the same between those markets, between UK, Australia, Canada, US, and what's happening that's consistent across those markets is it looks like consumption patterns have reached some sort of stability or equilibrium. So there's no longer big shifts in audience between broadcast and streaming or between streaming services. There's a real stability around consumption patterns, and that varies at age group. If you're in the 18 to 24 bracket, you'll have a different type of consumption than if you're in the over 55, for example. But that's a new thing, I think, the stability. And so how this goes to your question is, whereas a few years ago, there was a lot of investment in programming to make big acquisition inroads into a market, or to try and accrue large cohorts of subscribers to a service, or if you're a free-to-air broadcaster, to premiere on your BVOD player to try and get more people to use that service first. And that's sort of stabilized now, but really the challenge now for the broadcasters and the streamers and everybody is, if the consumption pool is generally stable and therefore you could say fixed, it is how then do you habituate usage within your service. So you may not be able to accrue significant new cohorts into your service, but what you do need to do is increase the engagement of the people that do use your service. And there's a really interesting, there was an interesting study here done in Australia a year or so ago, that if you did the same study in other markets, something similar would be shown. But it showed that when people come to their connected TV in Australia, 30% of them will come to it knowing what program they want to watch. So they come to it with a specific program in mind. The next 30% won't have a program, but they'll have a genre in mind. I want some comedy tonight, or some scripted drama, or crime procedural. And then the next 20% will be, oh, I don't know what I want to watch, but I know what service I'm going to go to, and I'll just use that service and find what I want. And then the other 20% will look at multiple services. But if you cut those numbers a different way, that means 70% of people are coming to their connected TV not knowing what they want to watch. And so the first thing they do then is default to a service. They'll have one service that they go to first that will have their genre preferences, or, it's their go-to. And
Yeah.
it's really important for broadcasters and their BVOD players or streamers to understand where they are in that pecking order, because you need to find a way to get yourself up the, the order of which service do I go to? Do I go to Netflix and then what? And to your question, Hayley, that's where things like digital premieres on the BVOD platforms, or even second window premieres, or you need more content. It needs to be better, and it needs to have a better relationship to content on your service. I think that's what's happening here.
Yeah, we've seen interesting what you're saying about second window. SBS, for example, have been increasingly taking second window from Disney after it's premiered on Disney Plus. Do you think we're going to see kind of more of that type of scheduling, collaboration, where broadcasters will follow the studios kind of more frequently?
Yeah, I do think so, and I think the logic behind it is that if you go back to that notion of sort of equilibrium or stability in consumption, Disney sort of got their cohort now, and what they need to do is find ways to keep engagement within their service. But equally, they know that if they start to release, be selective in their releasing of certain content into the licensing market, it's not going to get people leaving Disney, and it's not going to penalize them from an engagement and a subscriber point of view. And it is going to bring in additional revenue, and it is going to bring in some more exposure for their titles. So I think that will become more common, and you see that in the UK with ITV and Disney as well, and in France with TF1 and Netflix. They're different models, but they all talk to the fact that you can have your content platformed somewhere else, as long as you do it thoughtfully and selectively, and it is additive to your own platform, and it's not cannibalistic of or undermining of your own platform. So I think that's a trend that you'll see more of.
Yeah, and likely that the demographics that are viewing linear with the key broadcasters in the region probably haven't had a subscription to Disney Plus and seen that content, so it's new for them.
That's right. It's new reach, new exposure for the title. I presume Disney would have done their homework and realized that the SBS cohort, there will be some overlap, of course, but it's not massively significant, and so it's additive from a reach point of view, and certainly additive from a revenue point of view.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's talk about pay TV. There's been a big movement in the Aussie market at the moment with DAZN finishing their acquisition of your key pay TV service, Foxtel. Kind of what's your view on what may happen there? I mean, clearly they've got a kind of relatively successful SVOD service as well. We've been seeing some interesting windowing going on with Foxtel. Our movie tracker has shown that they've been sharing Pay One with the Pay One movie window with Netflix on a selection of titles, a lot from Universal, and the strategy appears to be working. Kind of more collaboration for Foxtel in the market. What do you think the DAZN era is going to bring for them?
Yeah,
a lot to unpick there. I appreciate that, Dan.
It's really interesting. Because they've had a couple of fairly seismic changes in the last 12 months. One is the DAZN acquisition, which is principally around sport. Foxtel is is the home of sport in Australia, although with Stan taking on the Premier League, it's sort of come into its own as
Yes.
well. So Foxtel has, of course, got KO, which is the sports-only subscription streamer here. It's a great service. And so that was the principal interest from DAZN. So that's one thing that's happened to them. And then, of course, HBO has launched Max here, HBO Max, and that the HBO and Warner Brothers output was exclusively Foxtel's prior to that, and on Binge, and so that's gone out into Max. So they're in a different position, and I think back to the comments I made at the start around their subscriber base being softening. If you look at the platforms in the market now, you're comparing their 1.6 or so million subscribers with Netflix's 6 million. They are not the platform in this market anymore. Netflix is probably the dominant platform in this market. So I wouldn't want to predict what they do, but I think co-exclusivity around pay one windows is really sensible when you go back to this equilibrium point, in that they're not going to lose a lot of subscribers from Foxtel to Netflix, because most of Foxtel subscribers will already have Netflix. So they don't stand to lose a lot by doing that. They'll need to keep sufficient differentiation so they don't have people churn off Foxtel. But look, their sports base is really holding them up there. So I don't know. That's one of the watch ones, Hayley. It's hard to predict how that might play out, but they are still a big, I think you'll know this in your data. They are the biggest spender on acquired content, for example, in Australia. Now they only go into second place if you add Nine Network and Stan together, and then that becomes the largest acquirer of content in Australia. But Foxtel, and probably a lot through its channel licensing, is still a very big spender on acquired content.
Yeah. Interesting. Let's see what happens and reconvene on that one. Fast. Now we've had a lot of conversations around fast for the past years, and Australia has always kind of featured early in those conversations about fast revenue, specifically outside of the US. So if I'm a distributor, kind of where can I make money in English-speaking markets, right, outside of the US, and Australia's come up. And I've also alluded to the fact I think it's kind of evolving more in line with Europe rather than the US, with the key local broadcaster involvement. Broadcasters are always in a strong position when it comes to kind of the advertising market, strength of their local content. Just to kind of give everyone a bit of context on Fast, it's hovering around kind of 750 unique channels in the Australian market. The growth kind of curve line looks like other major English-speaking markets. It's actually overtaken France and Spain in volumes of channels Australia has, and it's catching up with Germany. Talked about local broadcasters featuring as significant players. We've alluded to 7 Plus, 10 Play, who obviously had Pluto's support there. Single IP and local channels feature significantly on the BVOD fast services. And on a proportional basis, Australia has kind of the biggest percentage of its fast channel portfolio being sports than other major markets, unsurprisingly, but kind of driven by broadcasters leveraging their sports rights. So what do you think is going to happen with Fast, Dan? What can you tell us around kind of the Australian market?
Yeah, so I think the real advantage that Fast has had, and distributors of Fast channels have had in Australia, is that, as we said, the Fast channel groupings have really been around the broadcaster BVOD players, which has been great because they've got their own terrestrial linear channels being distributed over IP on the same platform, and they've all got good sports rights. Even Network 10's got some great football, soccer rights here. So the Fast channels have had the benefit of being in a very high-profile discovery platform, which is not always the case in where you've got pure play fast services. So I think that's good. And I think the other advantage that the fast channel market has in Australia is that it's integrated into the ad sales ecosystem of those broadcast
Yeah.
groups, which is really important as well. You just got a lot more sales and commercialization levers at your disposal in that sort of environment than if you're a pure play fast operator that's relying on sort of the programmatic market. So I think they've got all the foundations of success there in terms of discoverability, prominence, commercialization or commercial versatility. And so, but like anywhere, it's finding the content that's going to cut through. You know, there are pools of money that are that are sort of moving around in the ad space in Australia, and so it's not to be taken for granted that there'll always be a significant amount of ad spend looking to go into you know fast channels because money is moving around in the market. So I guess where it's got strengths, it's got some vulnerabilities as well.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, lastly, let's come on to SVOD. We've talked a bit about sports rights, and you mentioned that obviously Stan have the EPL rights, and it looks like that's going very well for them. I saw some data which said in the last couple of weeks it's helped them gain another 200,000 subscribers. HBO Max launched at the end of March. We talked about Binge. How do you think the SVOD market is going to evolve? Being Australia, do you think they need to invest more heavily in sports rights? We've seen kind of Prime Video do that in other markets, and other streamers get involved. Do you think that's what we're going to see in Australia?
I think, well, as you know, Hayley, the SVODs, as they've launched ad tiers, and as their headline subscriber growth has sort of softened, it's become very much an engagement play now. And so the type of content they're leaning towards is much more broadcast in nature than it has been for the subscription services, in part because they need to drive repeat engagement. They need to put more volume through their ad tiers, for example. And of course, one of the marquee genres of content for broadcast television is sport, and so the SVODs are, to a greater or lesser extent, trying to find a path into sport. Now, the global streamers don't particularly want to be localized in their sport activities. They want to find things that work across multiple markets. But in Australia, there are a few rights that aren't not held back from the market and are sort of protected for free-to-air broadcasters. So I can't see any of the global streamers really making big plays into sport unless there's some relaxation or some additional flexibility put into the listed events regulations over here. And that hinges on the same question as you would have seen rehearsed in the UK around, well, do these events have to be on free to air, or is free to view sufficient? Can you have an IP based platform that is available widely in the market, and does that deliver the accessibility requirement? So back to your question on the SVODs. Seven has got some of the major domestic codes locked up, along with KO through till I think around about 2030. The next big ticking item is the NRL rights, which is shared between Nine and Foxtel, coming up soon. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. It's hard to see major shifts going on in favour of some of the globals around sports in this next cycle, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But couldn't predict it.
Okay, good. Collaboration and partnerships. We've already spoke about some that we're seeing in the Australian market with sharing windowing. we've seen more in Europe as well with the streamers. So Disney Plus and ITVX doing quite a extensive kind of content sharing deal there. Netflix and TF1. How do you think Australia, the Australian services, are going to work in this space? Do you think we're going to see more partnerships between the broadcasters and streamers, between pay TV and the streamers? Do you think we're going to see more of it?
I think the lens to look through on that is what is the overlap between services and how many services in this market have a lower overlap, and therefore you can get incremental reach by swapping content or putting content across. And so, one of the topics in the UK, for example, has been the prevalence of broadcaster VOD on YouTube, and you wouldn't characterize that as a partnership, but you characterize that as a play for additional reach for Channel 4 and ITV, because you have to take the view that the reach or the audience you're going to get to on YouTube is not going to come to your BVOD players. Now, I just don't. The Australia market. Back to my remarks at the start, because the linear consumption and revenue picture here is just more stable and certainly less threatened and less sort of merging with the BVOD line than, say, UK, US, Canada. There's probably less intensity around needing to find new partnerships for new reach. So I don't see the imperative from some of the major domestic players for this sort of thing. Now, of course, there'll be appetites for bundles like you've seen in the US, SVOD to SVOD bundles. But I don't think they're transformative in nature. And then if you want to look at some that are more transformative in nature, you look at the TF1 Netflix deal, which I think is a transformative deal. And if you consider that as not just a French market occurrence, if it becomes a template, then how does that play into markets like Australia? That's interesting, because you look at the players in this market that don't have their own SVOD affiliation. Of course, Nine has Stan, and 10 has Paramount Plus, and it sort of leaves 7 there. And so, that's interesting. So I think that, and if you step back and you look at the fact that the market has reached an equilibrium of sorts, a stability of sorts, and revenue is sort of, stable and growing. But there are some players who've been caught a little bit short in terms of their scale ambitions in the market. So if things have sort of steadied a bit and you're a bit under where you thought you would be scale wise, maybe there's some more serious type of partnerships that might take place in the market that aren't just about content sharing or bundling. Maybe there needs to be some more serious partnerships to be looked at, but perhaps.
Yeah, I liked your term of kind of intensive partnership. Yeah, got you. Okay, content that works well in Australia. We've spoken about sports, but what about local shows that are exporting? I know kind of here in the UK, quite a few of shows that originated in Australia quite often appear on iPlayer. Colin from Accounts, for example, is one of my favourites. I think that came from Binge. Bluey has obviously gone kind of worldwide. That was an ABC and kind of BBC set up with Ludo Productions. We've seen some great co-commissions come out of the US. The the tourist. So we've seen quite a few shows where kind of they will work with a kind of US or UK partner. What for you kind of works? What shows are exporting and doing well?
Yeah, I think you've just seen actually, and I don't know the details, but you'll know the details. But I think Paramount have just done a co-production between Network 10 here and Channel 5 in the UK, for the very reason that the stories that will work over here are similar in nature to stories that will work in the UK and Canada and the US. So yeah, there are a lot of stories that travel well. Australians have grown up on British TV fare and American TV fare, so our TV sensibilities are very similar to what works well. And I think the Australian productions that have that that sort of more um, not global sensibility, but can sort of play into some of the
Uh-huh.
storylines that resonate in those markets, shows that will export well. And so, yeah, I think the the common parentage between a lot of the commissions that are happening here in Australia, whether they're from Netflix or Disney or from Paramount, etc., are geared at that sort of global-ish appeal.
Great, Dan. This has been fascinating. Kind of, there's so much to unpick in this session. We could have gone on for much longer, but I guess we should wrap things up. It's getting late for you over there. Thank you so much for joining us again on Inside Content. We really appreciate your insights and experience.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Inside Content, the TV industry podcast brought to you by 3Vision. With decades of TV industry experience and real-world success, we know the ins and outs of the market like nobody else. To learn more about our TV consultancy services, head to 3vision.tv.